I feel as though my views are perfectly congruent with the human nature and history and unimpeachably moral. So I reject any term that is pejorative. White supremacist also is just, I think, factually incorrect. I think that's a historic term that really should be retired because to me it means someone, a white person, who wishes to rule over people of other races. And I don't know anyone who has that desire. Most people with my views just want to be left alone, to be able to pursue our own destiny, as we wish to leave everyone alone to pursue their destiny too. So segregationist, that implies force. I believe in complete freedom of association. And when most people are free to associate, they prefer to be with people who are similar to themselves, not just in terms of race, but often in terms of religion, in terms of cultural preferences. In fact, there was a very interesting study about workplace preferences. And when people were allowed to express those preferences anonymously, they not only said they preferred to be with people of the same race, but of the same sex, the same age, and same general level of education. Those are the sorts of people with whom people are most comfortable at the workplace. And so given complete freedom of association, and if we could persuade the United States government and our institutions to recognize that this kind of preference is perfectly moral, I think that we could arrange for a peaceful and mutually beneficial separation. Every institution in the United States, from the president on down, is constantly promoting this view that I think runs against human nature, namely the idea that we should wish to be with people as unlike ourselves as possible, that diversity is a strength, and that, for example, if through immigration whites become a minority in the United States, that will simply be a joyful future to which we should look forward, because this will be the ultimate expression of diversity. And most whites, I believe, in their bones, feel that this would be very bad for them, for their culture and for their offspring, but they don't dare say so because of this rigidly dominant orthodoxy according to which any expression of white solidarity or white racial consciousness is considered evil. If people wish to live in diversity, if they like diversity, they should be free to enjoy it. But certainly my experience here in the United States is that blacks overwhelmingly have a racial consciousness, Hispanics likewise, Asians to a somewhat lesser degree, but they all have a sense of their collective interests. And that's why, just at the drop of a hat, you can accumulate hundreds, sometimes thousands of blacks who will demonstrate, sometimes violently, in what they take to be their own interests. Very difficult to get whites to do that. You can get Hispanics into the streets as well. And that is why blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, they all have political pressure groups, they all have organizations, nonprofit groups, that are set up explicitly to advance their interests, and if need be, at the expense of whites. It's only whites who do not have that kind of thing, and I think you would, with only the greatest of difficulty, find, for example, a black person who is not conscious of being black, who has a sense of solidarity with other blacks, and who feels that his fate is entwined with those of other blacks. And blacks who do not feel that way are somewhat embarrassed. They're considered Uncle Toms, they're looked down upon by other blacks, and I think they would hesitate to make a public profession of a lack of interest in the collective interests of blacks. Racial identitarianism in the United States goes back a long, long way. Don't forget this, I'm black and I'm proud. Black is beautiful. Those slogans go back to the 1960s. And perhaps you'll remember at the Olympics, there were black track athletes who took the medal stand with a raised fist. That was back in the 1960s or early 70s. This sense of blacks as being a nation within a nation. It goes back to Marcus Garvey. It goes back to people like W.B. Du Bois. There is a very, very vivid sense that they are here as a captive people and do not belong. You would find the same thing with American Indians. It goes back a long, long way. And when people talk about how, we'll have no trouble assimilating the Mexicans and the Haitians and the Guatemalans because we assimilated the Hungarians and the Italians and the Jews and the French, those people overlook the fact that there have been these two different racial groups living in the United States since long before the arrival of European ethnics who to this day are not assimilated. And that is because, in my view, race, biological differences, those are the most difficult barriers to cross in terms of any kind of meaningful assimilation. But just to reiterate, the idea of racial consciousness is something that has very, very deep roots in the United States, including among white people. You would probably have a very, very difficult time finding a major political figure in the United States or a major intellectual figure, except for a few outliers, a white person that did not have a sense of the United States being a nation that was an extension of Europe, that was to always be that way and would always have a white majority. This was something always taken for granted until perhaps the 1950s, 60s. So my view of race is one that is far more faithful to that of the Founding Fathers and to the American conception of the United States up until just a relatively small number of decades ago. Don't forget, this conception of whites as a group with distinct interests is by no means unique to the United States. The French and the British empires reflected a sense of race. I'm sure you're aware, people like Cecil Rhodes or the colonizers, Lord Lugard, who was that wonderful general who was involved, Garnet Wolseley. He was involved in practically every 19th century campaign overseas. They all had a very vivid sense of whites as being sort of the self-governing race. The British in particular, they were the self-governing and therefore the race that had the capacity to govern others. There's a very, very distinct sense of being a people with a mission. So it's not at all exclusive to the United States, but in Britain as well. I think perhaps even to an even more extraordinary degree, it is only in the last few years that this sense of destiny that the British people had, which I think was a remarkable thing, has been completely beaten out of them. This sort of, typical bloody Britain. If something goes wrong in Britain, or if the British athletes don't do so well in international sports, I think this is a terrible loss. So, no, it's not unique to the United States. The French as well had this mission civilisatrice.
Maybe I should have said the West.
This is a boogeyman of the left. Right. I remember having a conversation years ago with a leftist on this whole question of racial differences in IQ. And she was quite a committed leftist, and I was making some of the, I think, more powerful arguments, pointing out the evidence for this average IQ difference and why the IQ difference has probably got a substantial genetic contribution to it. And then she absolutely astonished me by saying, well, if that's true, we'll just have to exterminate them all. What? No, not at all. Not at all. Yes, you could have knocked me down with a feather. This kind of, and as I say, this was an absolute committed liberal who seemed to think that all of her conceptions of race depended on this assumption of equality, and if that were knocked out, then everything just completely fell apart. No. There's even Jim Crow South, even at the time when lynching was considered an appropriate punishment for black criminals, no one ever thought that, well, we just have to exterminate them all. Never. There was, of course, in the United States, a strong movement to free blacks and then repatriate them to Africa or some other part outside the United States. But no, the idea that this means some kind of subhuman, that's never been the case. Furthermore, I think it's important to point out the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was simply an expression of the United States' wish to part company with the colonial ruler. That passage, all men are created equal, by no means is reflected in the Constitution of the United States, which is a very inegalitarian document. When it came time to set the rules for how the United States was going to operate as a political entity, there's no idle chatter about egalitarianism. The purpose of that document, I believe, and that phrase, is to say to King George III and the people who were in the American eyes riding roughshod over their colonies, to say, look, you and I are equal. We are men just like you. and we choose to go our separate ways, and then there's this list of particulars of injustices that the colonists felt had been perpetrated against them.
Yeah.
So that is by no means any expression of general equality. The guy who wrote it, Thomas Jefferson, he was a slaveholder. It's very clear in his notes on Virginia that he did not think that blacks on average were as intelligent as whites. He had all sorts of speculations about how different races were different. People who are 16 years old are also human, but we don't give them the vote. We don't let them drive automobiles. We don't draft them for the military. We make distinctions on the basis of sex, on the basis of age, on the basis of education, and race is a biological phenomenon. Now, if you take in small numbers of individuals, it is entirely possible, and we have seen examples of this, of what I would call near total assimilation. However, once the number of minorities reaches a certain critical mass, then assimilation becomes very difficult. And in the United States, to this day, despite the fact that more than a half a century has gone by since the glory days of the civil rights movement, we still have race riots. We still have blacks and whites who will view the same phenomenon and have a completely different conception of what's happened. This, to me, is evidence that we should not attempt to live together in large numbers. We will be happier if we go our separate ways. And so this idea that diversity is a tremendous strength of the United States, to me, is clearly a preposterous, complete fantasy. The diversity of this kind is a source of conflict. First of all men are not created equal. There's not two single humans who are created equal.
I mean their rights. I don't mean the. I'm not a leftist. I mean they are equal in the rights under the law.
Well, I believe you are a great proponent of individual liberty, and individual liberty means individual choice. I believe that if you prefer to not associate with someone, you have every right to do so, whether your reasons are good or bad or none at all. You should have the right to refuse to deal with people because, after all, you've not hurt them. For example, if I'm captivated by some screen star and I think she's absolutely beautiful and I'm convinced I can make her happy, I approach her and she says, too bad, I don't want to associate with you. She owes me no explanation as to why she does not. It might be possible that I could make her happy, but no one would think that she is compelled to spend time with someone she does not wish to spend time with. Likewise, if my conception of a society is one that reflects the values of Europe, the culture of Europe, the kind of texture of life that Europeans create, and if my view is, and it's based, I think, on unimpeachable evidence, that if other people arrive in large numbers, they will change that texture of life. They will divert the direction of that culture. They will change the destiny of a certain people. Then I think I have every right voluntarily to say, no, I prefer the company of my people. I prefer to preserve the ways of my ancestors, and that I have every right to work to see that they will continue into the future. Your way of looking at things, it seems to me, will eventually mean that there's no distinction at all, that India will become indiscriminate and indistinguishable from Korea, that Turkey will be like Argentina. No, no, no. I want all of those places to remain unique and beautifully original, beautifully distinct. I don't think that compulsion is necessary. Right. The United States government, as it's set up today, is in the business of doing its damnedest to bring people together. We have abrogated the right that you have just affirmed of free association. If I'm an employer, I cannot simply hire left-handed people. Well, I guess I could, because that's not a protected class. If I am a black employer and I'm running a nightclub that is frequented by blacks, I don't have the right to hire an all-black staff, although no one will bother you if you do. If you're a white person, then you'd come under scrutiny. We should have complete freedom to do what we wish to do. The government is vigilant to make sure that this does not happen, that schools are integrated, work sites are integrated, neighborhoods are integrated. As I say, every institution in American society is based on the idea that integration is a good thing, to the point where very, very few whites, despite the fact that they live in segregated neighborhoods and they send their children to largely white schools, very few whites would dare say, well, yeah, of course I prefer to live in a white neighborhood. So if the government got out of the business of fighting human nature and encouraged the expression of healthy human nature, I do not think that compulsion would be required. At the same time, there can be incentives built in for people to be asked or paid to return to their country of origin. The French have tried this. The Germans have tried this.